I once walked into a bookstore and I noticed this book called Open Innovation. This was actually at the time when I became interested in doing research on innovation, and the title of this book really intrigued me. I was really interested by the examples and explanations that the author, Henry Chesbrough, gave about why firms should increasingly not only rely on internal ideas, on internal paths to market, but also should rely on external ideas and external commercialization opportunities, have more open business models. And actually one of the most interesting parts of this book is hidden in the end, in the little footnote at the end of the book, where Chesbrough highlights this fact, this idea that no matter who you are, no matter how innovative you are as a company, most of the smart people still not work for your organization. In fact, most of the smart people work for somebody else. This is also why I've decided to, in the context of opening up open innovation, not only talk about what are different aspects of open innovation, how I've worked with open innovation, how I suggest we should all work more on different topics related to open innovation. But I've also opened the lecture to some external sources, and I've invited some people to say a few words about different aspects of open innovation. And the first person I invited was Henry Chesbrough, who is a professor at UC Berkeley, and also called the father of open innovation after he wrote this book. So I give the word to Henry.
Hello, I'm Henry Chesbrough, and this video is for Professor Bogers. Marcel and I met around this book, Open Innovation, which was actually written back in 2003. Since that time, open innovation has come a long, long way. And part of that evolution is there is a new generation of scholars that is pushing it forward further, farther, and faster. I would say that Marcel is at the forefront of this new generation of scholars. He is now teaching me about open innovation, whether it's in food or in ecosystems and networks. Marcel, congratulations on your appointment as a full professor. Now get back to work.
And I always thought that once you become full professor, you can stop working, but maybe it's not true anymore. But talking about getting back to work, one of the things that I've been doing is work with Henry also on a number of things, including contribution to this book here, on New Frontiers of Open Innovation, where we had the opportunity to publish a book chapter where we also wanted to give an updated definition of what open innovation is all about. And in this definition we want to highlight that open innovation is very much about the distributed innovation process. It's about all those smart people out there, all these opportunities to commercialize your technologies out there. But it's also a process where you need to manage the knowledge that is flowing into your organization and out of your organization. Which needs to be also in line with your business model, because you need to think about how do you create and capture value, how do you make money as a company in the end as well. Now this is of course a nice academic definition, but what does it mean in practice? So one example is one of the early movers, you may say, in the open innovation practice domain, which is Procter & Gamble, where at some point they, after some brainstorming session, had the idea to print some images, text, and so on their Pringles product. It turns out that when they wanted to find a technology to do this exact thing, it was very difficult for them. And they have a lot of smart people working in research and development, but it turned out to be more difficult than they anticipated. Then instead of maybe abandoning the idea or maybe going further into all kinds of research processes, they decided to open up to external partners, their networks, and try to see if there's maybe somebody out there who has a solution to this particular problem. Then it also turned out that there was a bakery in Bologna, in Italy, where they already had solved this problem. They were already producing bread that were used this exact technology that they needed for this solution. And then it turned out that Procter & Gamble was able to insource this technology for a fraction of the cost and of the time it would have taken them to develop it by themselves. Another example of a company that understands quite well the importance of open innovation is Lego. So at Lego, one of the early examples is Lego Mindstorms, which is basically a combined hardware, software toolkit to build your own robot. It turned out that once they started selling this product, that all kinds of users started to say hack into it. They started to make all kinds of improvements. As far as I understand, it took Lego quite some time to find out how should we react to that. In the end, they decided to embrace this and to embrace the notion of users organizing themselves into communities, in hacking into this product that also helped Lego to better understand some problems that they had with this product, and it allowed them to sell more of it and to actually get input into their own innovation processes as well. A more recent example is Lego Ideas, which basically is a crowdsourcing platform. So anybody in the world can basically submit an idea for a Lego product, and if there's enough support for that particular idea, they will basically just produce it and sell it. Yet another example from a slightly different industry is Philips. Philips is also an interesting example where they have developed a range of products based on principles of open innovation. And I think it may be fair to say that we would not have some of these products, including the CD, Blu-ray, if it was not for open innovation. Because Philips is really a company that is also explicit on their website about the fact that they embrace open innovation. They do what they call outside-in innovation, which is really about tapping into all these external knowledge, individuals, organizations that they can learn from and they can integrate into their own innovation processes. They also do inside-out innovation, which is really about leveraging the knowledge, the technologies that you have in-house and putting them into the market to find external partners to work with this technology. And this is also what I have done with some of these examples in a way to develop these technologies in a collaborative way. A final example where I also invited a video contribution, in this case from Susanne Stroman, to explain a little bit more about how Novo Nordisk work with some aspects of open innovation.
My name is Susanne Stroman. I lead the corporate sustainability function in Novo Nordisk. We are a global healthcare leader. Our mission is to drive change to defeat diabetes and other serious chronic diseases. We built our leadership through innovation in the labs and through the skills in our production facilities. But we also know that leadership takes much more than medicine. And to lead in the fight against diabetes, we need to establish new solutions through open innovation. One of the examples is the initiative called Cities Changing Diabetes. It's a partnership platform where we collaborate with currently 11 cities around the world, representing more than 100 million people. And what we do is to try and solve that immense challenge of the rise in diabetes that is costing human suffering, loss of productivity, incredible healthcare costs. In other words, it's a big global issue. We work with academics, we work with NGOs, we work with city administrations to find ways to make cities that are much more livable in a healthy way, where you have choice of food, you have opportunities for exercise, you have smarter ways to move around. That is not our expertise, and that is why we rely on the innovation from our partners.
So I think this is also a great example of a company that actually has a really big knowledge base internally. They do a lot of things in-house, and they have their innovation funnel in which they develop certain products and services. But at the same time, as Susanne is highlighting, they also understand that they need to open up these boundaries. And this is really what open innovation is all about. So what you also try to explain is that they need to sort of go into this, what we may call inbound open innovation, tapping into these NGOs, academics, as you said, and so on, to accelerate your own innovation process. This is also what you saw in the examples of Procter & Gamble and Lego, for example. At the same time, we can think about more outbound open innovation processes. This is also what I tried to highlight in the context of Philips. So Philips is actually a company that has a lot of technology, they have a lot of intellectual property, patents, trademarks, and so on, that they're able to leverage by going into partnerships, by selling them through licenses and generating revenue income from them. In that case, again, Philips, also it's often about combining these inbound and outbound processes through a coupled open innovation process, by really collaboratively working and allowing others to use your knowledge, but also be able to use the knowledge of others in accelerating that innovation process. So in some of our research, and in this case particular an article with my colleague Joel West, we've tried to understand, okay, what does this process of leveraging external sources of innovation really look like? Here we identified a few phases in this process model, where you go from obtaining the innovation from outside, integrating it into your company, and ultimately commercializing it by offering something to your customers. While there are also some interaction mechanisms in this process as well. So what does this all mean? Well, this first step of obtaining innovation from the outside is basically about getting a lot of stuff into your innovation funnel. I gave some examples, Lego, Procter & Gamble, and so on, where there are different mechanisms to do that. You can work with crowdsourcing platforms, you can work with intermediary companies who help you to get the knowledge in, you can have your own search strategies to try to identify possible sources of innovation. But once you have obtained this knowledge, that's only half of the story, right? Because then you need to think about, okay, how do I actually integrate it into my innovation processes? And here we often see a lot of problems also in practice, where companies are actually struggling because they may not have the right absorptive capacity, they may not have the right knowledge to actually understand the knowledge that is coming from outside. They may not have the right organizational structures or processes to actually move around this knowledge in their organization. Or they may not really have the right mindset, the right culture. And here we also identify something we call the not invented here syndrome, which is basically a negative attitude towards ideas coming from the outside. And you see this very much in very innovative companies, where there are a lot of smart people working who think they should be the ones that come up with all the great ideas, and as such they kind of reject ideas that are coming from the outside. Then once you have integrated this innovation into your process, you know, it's not that there's a pot of gold waiting for you at the end of the rainbow. You still need to think about, okay, what are my commercialization capabilities that allow me to really profit from this kind of innovation? Do you have the right business model to work with this knowledge that was generated from the outside? To what extent is this different from the capabilities, business models that you used to work with before? And finally, of course, we make it look like a nice linear model, but in the end it is more complex than that as well. You may also have interaction mechanisms of certain parts of this process going back into the system. You have more interaction processes with external partners, with communities, and so on. So in the end, leveraging external sources of innovation is a complex process where you need to think about how can you work with these different kinds of aspects in your innovation process, and how can you work with this kind of complexity in order to create and capture value and profit from it at the end of the day. Now, one way to open up this notion of open innovation is by thinking about not only how does it relate to company context, as I've been talking about mostly up to now, but also think about how does it relate to science? How can we apply open innovation principles in the context of scientific research? Here one interesting example is the initiative called Open Innovation in Science, which is really about trying to apply those open innovation principles in a scientific context. For example, this lab of open innovation in science is also trying to teach scientists to use some of these open innovation principles to apply that into their own work. to have better science, to have better innovation, and to have more impact through their scientific research. Here I've also invited one of my colleagues from CBS, Marianne, to say a few words about that initiative, also especially in her capacity as director of the lab and center that is connected to this Open Innovation in Science initiative.
The open innovation phenomenon has so far been mainly looked at from a corporate perspective. As part of the Ludwig Boltzmann Gesellschaft's Open Innovation in Science initiative, we have started investigating if, and if yes, how, and under which conditions, applying principles and methods of open innovation can contribute to improving novelty, efficiency, and impact of scientific research, from generating research questions to eventually translating scientific knowledge into innovation. First cases, such as the crowdsourcing of research questions among patients and their caretakers, and intermediate results from our own open innovation science research, suggest promising results. Thank you, Marcel, for contributing to our Lab for Open Innovation Science, a special training program in which scientists can learn about and experiment with the application of principles and methods of open innovation along the entire scientific research and innovation process. And all the very best wishes on your inauguration.
Thank you, Marianne. Then also to show that sometimes we also practice what we preach, I want to present this article that I've written kind of under the leadership of myself and my colleague Anne-Christine Sobel from ETH Zurich, where we have worked in total with 23 authors, and I can tell you this is not how we usually write our papers. We've tried to open up also our own process in trying to understand what does the open innovation research landscape really look like, by inviting all kinds of different experts that allowed us to really get a more complete picture and to extend our understanding of what open innovation was all about. And I can tell you it was interesting to observe some of the principles of open innovation that we tried to apply in this process, including some of the challenges. I can also tell you about that. But the interesting thing is that we really found out, even more than we expected, how we can really study and think about open innovation across different levels of analysis. When we move from individuals in organizations, to business models, to ecosystems, to the society at large. And one of the things that we identified in this process were this kind of research categories that we basically proposed as larger sets of perspectives, combinations of perspectives that we think are useful to further explore what open innovation means and to further explore the implications that open innovation may have in other domains. And here we look at things like behavior and cognition, strategy and design, stakeholders, ecosystems, and governance, as specific examples of how we can really further develop and open up the notion of open innovation. Then I just want to go into some examples of research that I have done, also with many different colleagues, and kind of go across different levels of analysis and give you an idea of how I've been trying to work with it, and also as a basis for future research in this context. So one example is an article where we looked into what we call the human side of open innovation, which is really about trying to understand some of the individual characteristics of employees and how that affects the openness of the firm in terms of relying on external sources of knowledge. And here we found that in particular we looked at diversity of employees in terms of educational background, in terms of job experience, that kind of diversity had a particular impact on how open the firm as a whole was in terms of relying on external sources of knowledge. Another example is where we look at the context of university-industry collaboration, where in this particular case we're really interested in understanding some of the cognitive aspects as well. How can you really understand, for example, leadership in university-industry collaboration, and in particular in the context of joint research labs, and how can we understand some of the leadership and cognitive aspects in that domain? Another example is research where we looked into the notion what we call collaborative prototyping, and this was really a particular type of approach to problem solving where we identified the ability not only to get cross-fertilization of knowledge across organizational boundaries, which is what we usually talk about in open innovation, but also across functional boundaries within the organization, and at the same time across hierarchical boundaries, sort of different levels of the organization as such, and how this combined process really enabled a better problem-solving process. Another context that we're also interested in is more, say, the context of entrepreneurship, where in this particular case we were interested in exploring how do some of these principles of open innovation affect startup entrepreneurs. And here we also found some indication that certain aspects of open innovation did really enable startup entrepreneurs to launch their venture. We've also been looking at more large and established organizations. In this particular case, it's an article that reports on the study where we looked at the postal industry, and postal operators are really one of the oldest organizations out there. So you can also imagine it's sometimes hard for these kind of organizations to go into new areas, to explore new kinds of business models. And here we identified different kinds of organizational aspects that these companies need to go into to really explore new business models. And some aspects of that had to do with, do you develop something in-house, or do you source it in through an open innovation way if you need to access those kind of capabilities. And we've also been doing some research in this case, to explore the potential for business model innovation in the Danish gastronomic sector, where it was really interesting to observe what are some of the clusters in terms of types of business models that we could identify in this particular case, but also we saw some potential in terms of where some of these business models may go. And here again, some of these examples had to do with a more open innovation type of business model. Then we usually, in our research, tend to talk about large organizations. That's also many of the examples that I gave. But at the same time, we also need to look into small and medium-sized enterprises, because these SMEs have fundamentally different characteristics also than some large organizations. So also in terms of opening up their innovation processes, we need to think about what are the differences, what are the specific characteristics of small companies that allow them to open up their innovation processes. In this particular study, we've also been looking at how a set of SMEs in a larger ecosystem were trying to work with the value that was created and captured on the level of the ecosystem, which then of course has also implications for how organizations, and SMEs in particular in this case, should organize themselves in order to really capture part of the value that they create in that larger ecosystem. I think also the notion of innovation ecosystem is a really interesting one. Also because more and more innovation activities are taking place in ecosystems, in collection of organizations that are dependent on each other in order to develop, say, a joint innovation. And here in this particular study was also quite interesting, where we looked at the different generations of mobile telephony, so 1, 2, 3G, and so on. And we really observed some very interesting and important changes of how certain aspects of open innovation really changed over the course of this different generational development, which also has major impact of how as an organization you relate to this kind of development. Where do you put in your technology? How do you work with intellectual property? And how does that change over time? And I think that was also a very interesting observation here. To open up even more, we've also been looking at the context of public administration. So you can also think about to what extent can we apply some open innovation principles, for example, when governments are interested to motivate their citizens to engage in online ideation processes, for example, which is also a particular context where we need to think about to what extent do what we know about open innovation really work in those contexts, and how can we learn from it to better understand the theory behind open innovation. To think even more out of the box, we've even been looking at the role of humor and how humor really shapes innovation processes, where we also identified some differences between how people relate to colleagues from their own organization relative to people that are working outside of their organization. What is then maybe less funny, so to say, or at least also very serious, is that we've also been looking at how we can address some of the societal challenges that we face as a society, but of course also as organizations. And in that case, I think it's really important and also interesting to think about the complexity of these societal challenges and how organizations are working with addressing those challenges. And in this particular case, we're also looking into how does an organization or even how does a process of organizing really work when you want to address a challenge that you don't really fully understand before you go into it. And this was a case of traffic safety, but you can also think of other cases like food security, climate change, and so on. So along those lines, I've also invited Sustainability Director from Carlsberg to say a few words about their approach to open innovation and how it helps them to address their sustainability goals.
Marcel has asked me to say a few words about innovation and more specifically open innovation. To me, as the Sustainability Director, innovation is absolutely key for us to achieve our targets. Last year in June, we launched our new sustainability program called Together Towards Zero, and we have targets towards 2022 and 2030. One thing is for sure, without innovation and without doing things completely different, we won't be able to reach our targets. One of the examples of where we have done things completely differently is on a project that we refer to as the Green Fiber Bottle Project. 3 years ago, we set out on a journey to develop the world's first bio-based beer bottle. And to be honest, we actually didn't know exactly how to do it. We had a small partner called EcoExpac, and we had some interested parties that wanted to work with us on making the green fiber bottle, but we didn't have all the answers. So what we did was that we went out to the outside world and invited everyone who might be able to help us on this journey to provide ideas and innovation that could actually help us achieve the goal of creating the bottle. Now, 3 years later, we are looking to launch the bottle in the later half of this year, and one thing is for sure, we would never have been able to do it if we had not invited others in and had actually told the world that we wanted to create this crazy idea of a bio-based beer bottle. So to me, this shows the power of innovation. It shows the power of openness, and I'm 100% sure that the future will bring much more innovative projects where you do things differently and thereby get much bigger reward. So that's all that I wanted to say, and I'd also like to congratulate Marcel with his new position, and good luck, and I hope that we'll cooperate much more going forward.
So of course I'm not going to say no to collaboration with Carlsberg, right? But I think it's an interesting example where of a company that's really trying to move somehow from a societal challenge to having a sustainable solution, and in particular then the role of open innovation in that process. Now that I'm moving towards the end of this lecture, I was actually trying to go back to the beginning, and I was actually thinking back of my very first conference as a PhD student, which was hosted by Eric van Hippel at MIT. And Eric's work has been extremely influential in understanding the sources of innovation, and it has been a great opportunity to also learn from him at that point in time. Some of his recent work is also very interesting, because his recent book on free innovation, he's highlighting that there are a lot of consumers out there that develop all kinds of innovation and basically share them for free. And this has indeed a lot of implications for social welfare, but it also has a lot of implications for how do we understand innovation processes in the first place, and how do organizations really work with those kinds of more free innovation processes. And also in some of my own work, I've been really interested in trying to understand the role of users as innovators. Try to understand what are the really underlying characteristics of these kinds of innovation processes. You know, what are really the sources of innovation? Where does it come from? What are the mechanisms? But then also, what are the implications for organizations, for companies that try to tap into that as a particular source of innovation? What kind of mechanisms can you create, and how can you really work with that? So I've also actually invited Eric to say a few words about some of his research and some of these different research streams.
Very happy to congratulate Marcel on this wonderful occasion, and also to congratulate the University of Copenhagen in choosing to hire Marcel in the first place, and in choosing to honor him in this full professorship. Marcel has played a very important role in integrating our various communities who are engaged in sort of new research on new forms of innovation, like open innovation, free innovation, user innovation, and so forth. I know he will continue this role and exciting new research for many years to come. So, best wishes.
I think it's really great to think about these different research streams, as Eric also highlights, and what we can learn from them, how can we connect them. I think also opening up open innovation is very much about thinking about what are other kinds of perspectives, other aspects of innovation processes, and how can we put it all together in a broader understanding of how innovation works in a broad sense. I also think that some of Eric's work is interesting in the sense that it doesn't only have implications for understanding innovation, for working with innovation in the business context, but it's also, I think, a stepping stone towards thinking about what are some of the policy implications of these kind of innovation processes. So as such, I think we can open up even further. I talked about open innovation in business, in science, but what about policy? In that sense, I think it's interesting to observe some of the initiatives also that the European Commission is undertaking in terms of creating a vision for Europe that is about open innovation, open science, and open to the world. I've also invited one of the leading figures in this development, the EU Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation, to say a few words about this kind of developments.
Congratulations to Marcel Bogers for his professorship at the University of Copenhagen. I'm very excited to go there and to meet you. Open innovation has been one of my passions for the last 20 years. I was very lucky to have as a professor in the year 2000 Henry Chesbrough, and through our dear friend Marcel Bogers we met again, and we were able to write about it, to write about the effects of open innovation for policymakers, open innovation for countries, and the importance of open innovation to create impact, to change the lives of people, but also to change the way governments work. So Marcel, thank you very much for your work. Thank you very much for your inspiration. Thank you very much for accepting to write a scientific paper with a politician, with our dear friend Henry Chesbrough, and all the best for the future with an open innovation future, an open science future, and an open to the world future.
So as the Commissioner also mentioned, I had the opportunity to actually write an academic article together with him. And in terms of opening up to new perspective, that was also a very interesting experience. I would definitely say it was a big opportunity, and it still is an opportunity to build on those kind of connections. I think that's also another type of openness that we should embrace as academics, to think about how can we think across these different levels and across these different boundaries. In this particular case, we try to write up some of our considerations about where should research, practice and policy in terms of open innovation be going, and try to give some considerations about how that is connected to some of the challenges that we face as a society and how we can link some of these different things. I think as such it's also interesting to observe that there are indeed certain tensions even between research, practice and policy. And in that sense I want to highlight also one of my earlier papers which I call the open innovation paradox. In this case, this was really about the tension between sharing and the protection of knowledge, where you can imagine that can be really a challenge and a tension in terms of, okay, how much do you share, how much do you open up, and how do you want to protect it? But at the same time, as I highlighted before, I think there are also other kinds of paradoxes. Between research, practice, and policy, there are also different kind of paradoxes when we think about different perspectives on open innovation, about between different levels of analysis, and how can we really bring those things together. As such, I thought it was quite appropriate to end this lecture with a quote of Niels Bohr, who I can now proudly say, I guess, is one of my colleague professors at this very faculty, who at some point said, how wonderful that we have met with a paradox, because now we have some hope of making progress. So I also hope in this lecture that I opened up a little bit towards my understanding of open innovation, towards how I have tried to work with open innovation, and towards how we can open up open innovation more generally. Thank you very much for your attention.